My name is Owais. I'm 29 years old, and on August 28th, 2018, I committed one of the most shameful acts of my life. I had been a radical Muslim immigrant filled with hatred for Christians and everything they represented. What happened after I spat on that innocent nun outside the cathedral changed my heart forever. I arrived in this country 3 years earlier as a young Muslim immigrant, carrying not just my belongings, but years of religious indoctrination and resentment that had been building since my teenage years. The journey to America was supposed to represent hope, opportunity, a fresh start in the land of freedom and prosperity. But instead of embracing the possibilities that lay before me, I brought with me a heart already poisoned by extremist teachings and a worldview that saw Christians not as fellow human beings, but as enemies of my faith. The moment I stepped off the plane and saw crosses on churches dotting the landscape, I felt a familiar surge of anger rise in my chest. Back home, I had been taught that America was a Christian nation that oppressed Muslims worldwide, that every church represented a monument to the persecution of my people. These weren't just buildings to me, they were symbols of everything I had been conditioned to hate and resist. Everything about American Christian culture felt like an assault on my Islamic identity and beliefs. The sight of Christian symbols in public spaces, the casual way Americans talked about Jesus, the freedom with which they practiced their faith, all of it triggered a deep resentment that I had been nurturing for years. Instead of seeing religious freedom as something that protected my right to worship Allah, I viewed it as Christian privilege that somehow diminished my own faith. I spent hours daily consuming extremist content online that painted Christians as enemies of Islam, as infidels who deserved punishment for their false worship. These websites and videos fed my anger with a steady diet of propaganda that twisted Islamic teachings to justify hatred. The more content I consumed, the more convinced I became that Christians were not just wrong in their beliefs, but actively working to destroy Islam and oppress Muslims around the world. The internet became my echo chamber, where every radical thought was reinforced and amplified by others who shared my twisted perspective. I would spend entire evenings watching videos that portrayed Christians as crusaders seeking to eliminate Islamic faith, conveniently ignoring the peaceful Christians I encountered daily who showed me nothing but kindness and respect. The extremist narrative was more compelling than reality because it fed the anger that was already burning in my heart. Instead of making an effort to integrate into American society, I became more isolated and angry with each passing month. I avoided meaningful interactions with my Christian coworkers, interpreting their friendly overtures as attempts to convert me or evidence of their supposed superiority complex. When they invited me to lunch or asked about my faith with genuine curiosity, I saw manipulation and condescension where none existed. I surrounded myself only with others who shared my radical views, creating a bubble where our hatred could grow unchecked. We would meet regularly to discuss how Christians were supposedly persecuting Muslims worldwide, how the churches were centers of anti Islamic propaganda, how their very existence in positions of influence was evidence of a conspiracy against our faith. These gatherings were toxic breeding grounds for the kind of extremist thinking that would eventually lead to my shameful actions. I convinced myself that hating Christians was not just acceptable, but required by my faith, completely ignoring the Quranic teachings about treating people of other faiths with respect and dignity. In my twisted interpretation of Islam, love and tolerance were signs of weakness, and hatred was a form of religious devotion. I believed that Allah would be pleased with my anger toward those who didn't worship Him correctly. The poison of this hatred began affecting every aspect of my life. I became suspicious of Christian customers at my job, believing they were looking down on me or trying to cheat me because of my faith. I interpreted normal business interactions through the lens of religious conflict, seeing persecution where there was only routine commerce. My worldview became so distorted that I couldn't see Christians as individuals with their own struggles and hopes. I began looking for opportunities to express my hatred, to strike back against what I saw as Christian oppression, even though no Christian had ever actually oppressed me personally. This desire for confrontation grew stronger as I consumed more extremist content, as I spent more time in radical online forums where violence against Christians was celebrated and encouraged. I fantasized about ways to humiliate Christians, to make them feel the anger and resentment that consume me daily. The sight of every cross, every church, every Christian symbol became a personal affront to my sense of religious superiority. I would drive out of my way to avoid passing churches, not out of respect, but out of disgust. When I couldn't avoid them, I would mutter curses under my breath, treating these sacred spaces as enemy territory in a war that existed primarily in my own mind. My heart became so hardened that I began to see acts of violence against Christians as justified responses to their supposed crimes against Islam. I celebrated news stories about churches being vandalized or Christians being attacked, believing that they deserved whatever suffering came their way. The compassion that should exist in every human heart had been systematically destroyed by years of consuming hatred disguised as religious devotion. What started as resentment grew into fantasies of violence and revenge against innocent believers who had done nothing to me personally. I would imagine scenarios where I could confront Christians, where I could make them feel small and afraid, where I could strike a blow for what I believed was the cause of Islam. These dark thoughts became more frequent and more detailed as my hatred intensified. Think about how destructive it is when we allow hatred to take root in our hearts and grow unchecked. I had become exactly the kind of person that gives religion a bad name, someone who uses faith as an excuse for hatred rather than love. My version of Islam bore no resemblance to the peace and mercy that the religion actually teaches, but I was too blinded by extremist propaganda to see the contradiction. The tragedy was that I was destroying my own soul while believing I was serving God, poisoning my own heart while thinking I was defending my faith. I had become a walking example of how dangerous it is when religion is twisted to justify hatred instead of promoting the love and compassion that should characterize any genuine relationship with the divine. That Tuesday afternoon started like so many others had in recent months, with me consuming another dose of extremist content that fed the hatred burning in my heart. I had spent my lunch break watching an online sermon from a radical preacher who spoke about the supposed war between Islam and Christianity, about how Christians in America was secretly working to undermine Muslim immigrants like myself. His words resonated with the anger I had been nurturing for 3 years, confirming every bitter thought I had entertained about the people of this country who claimed to follow Jesus. I was walking through downtown after work, my mind still churning with the inflammatory rhetoric I had absorbed earlier. The familiar weight of resentment sat heavy on my chest as I navigated the busy sidewalks, seeing enemies where others saw neighbors. Every person I passed seemed like a potential threat to my faith. Every business seemed like evidence of Christian dominance in a country where I felt increasingly isolated and angry. That's when I saw her, and the sight stopped me cold with a surge of a pure hatred that surprised even me with its intensity. There, walking peacefully toward the large cathedral that dominated the downtown skyline, was an elderly nun in full traditional habit. Her white wimple framed a kind face that showed no awareness of the storm of rage building in the heart of the young man watching her from across the street. She moved slowly but purposefully, probably in her 70s, carrying herself with the dignity that comes from a lifetime of service to others. Her black habit rustled softly as she walked, and I could see that she held a small prayer book in her weathered hands. To anyone else, she would have appeared to be exactly what she was, a devoted servant of God going about her daily spiritual duties with quiet reverence. But to me, in my twisted state of mind, she represented everything I had been taught to hate. Here was Christianity personified, walking freely through the streets of what I believed should be neutral territory. Her very presence felt like a declaration of Christian supremacy, a visible reminder that this country belonged to followers of Jesus rather than followers of Allah. The sight of her traditional religious garments triggered every radical thought I had entertained over the past 3 years. Something inside me snapped in that moment, and I felt a cold determination settle over me like a dark cloud. All my months of built up rage, all my consumption of extremist propaganda, all my fantasies about striking back against Christians suddenly focused on this innocent woman who had done nothing more than choose to serve God in the way she believed was right. She became the target for every grievance I held against American Christianity. My heart began pounding with malicious intent as I quickened my pace to intercept her path. The rational part of my mind, the part that still remembered my mother's teachings about treating elders with respect, tried to speak up and stop what was about to happen. But that voice was quickly drowned out by the louder chorus of hatred that had been my constant companion for so long. I had convinced myself that what I was about to do was somehow justified, that this elderly nun deserved whatever humiliation I could inflict upon her simply because she represented a faith I had been taught to despise. In my extremist mindset, she wasn't an individual human being with her own hopes and fears and struggles. She was a symbol, an enemy combatant in a religious war that existed primarily in my own poisoned imagination. As I approached her, she looked up and made brief eye contact with me, offering the kind of gentle smile that elderly people often give to younger ones they encounter on the street. There was no fear in her eyes, no suspicion or hostility, just the natural warmth of someone who had spent decades learning to see the image of God in every person she met. Her smile should have melted my heart, should have reminded me of my own grandmother's kindness, but instead it only fueled my rage. I was close enough now to see the lines on her face, the gentle way she held her prayer book, the small silver cross that hung from her neck. She was completely vulnerable, completely trusting, completely unaware that the young man approaching her was filled with enough hatred to commit an act that would shame him for the rest of his life. She had no reason to fear me, no way of knowing that I had spent years consuming propaganda that painted people like her as enemies of my faith. Without any provocation from her, without her even acknowledging my presence beyond that initial smile, I walked directly up to the sister and committed the most shameful act of my entire life. I spat directly in her face, watching as my saliva struck her cheek and began running down toward her chin. The disgust and hatred I felt for what she represented erupted in that moment of unspeakable disrespect. You need to understand the magnitude of what I had just done. This wasn't just an assault on an elderly woman, though it was certainly that. This was an attack on someone who had devoted her entire life to serving others, someone who had taken vows of poverty and service, someone who represented the very best of human compassion and dedication. I had just desecrated something sacred, violated someone whose only crime was choosing to follow Jesus instead of Muhammad. The moment my spit hit her face, I expected her to scream, to recoil in horror, to call for help or security. I expected anger, fear, outrage, all the natural human responses to such a degrading assault. I wanted her to be afraid, wanted her to feel small and humiliated, wanted her to understand that her face made her a target for my hatred. I was prepared for any response except the one she actually gave. Instead of screaming, running, or calling for help, she simply reached into her habit and pulled out a clean white handkerchief. With movements that were calm and deliberate, she gently wiped the spit from her face while looking at me with eyes that held no anger, no fear, no desire for revenge. The expression on her face was one of profound sadness mixed with unmistakable compassion. Then she spoke words that would echo in my mind for years to come, words that would eventually help save my soul from the hatred that was destroying it. She said quietly, with a voice that trembled, not with fear, but with genuine concern for my spiritual condition. God bless you, my son. Jesus loves you more than you know. Her response confused and enraged me further because it was the exact opposite of what my extremist worldview had prepared me to expect. I had been taught that Christians were hateful, vindictive people who would strike back at any attack on their faith. I had expected her to prove everything I believed about the supposed evil nature of Christianity. Instead, she had responded to my hatred with love, to my attack with blessing, to my assault with prayer. This wasn't how the script was supposed to go. This wasn't the reaction that would confirm my beliefs about Christian hypocrisy and hatred. This gentle, loving response threatened everything I thought I knew about the people I had been trained to hate, and it filled me with a confusion that only intensified my rage. Within seconds of my spit hitting her face, something began happening to me that defied all natural explanation. My mouth and throat started burning with an intensity I had never experienced in my entire life. It wasn't the kind of burning you might feel from eating spicy food or drinking something too hot. This was something far more severe, far more supernatural, like liquid fire had been poured directly into my respiratory system and was now coursing through every part of my mouth and throat. The Burning sensation started exactly where my saliva had originated, deep in my mouth, and then spread with alarming speed down my throat and into my chest. It felt as though invisible flames were consuming me from the inside, creating a pain so intense that I immediately understood this was no ordinary physical response. The timing was too perfect, the onset too immediate, the intensity too overwhelming to be anything other than supernatural intervention. I tried to swallow, thinking that might relieve the burning sensation, but swallowing only made it worse. The fire seemed to intensify with every movement of my throat muscles. Every attempt to alleviate the pain only amplified it beyond what I thought was humanly bearable. My eyes began watering uncontrollably, not from emotion, but from the sheer physical intensity of what was happening inside my mouth and throat. Panic set in as I realized that this wasn't going away on its own, wasn't some temporary reaction that would fade in a few moments. If anything, the burning was getting stronger, spreading further, becoming more unbearable with each passing second. I grabbed at my throat with both hands, as if I could somehow massage away the supernatural fire that was consuming me from within. The sister, meanwhile, had pulled out a clean handkerchief and was gently cleaning her face with movements that were calm and deliberate. She showed no anger, no desire for revenge, no satisfaction that I was clearly experiencing some kind of divine retribution for my attack. Instead, she was watching me with concerned, loving eyes that seemed to understand exactly what was happening to me, even when I didn't understand it myself. I wanted to continue my attack, to say more hateful things, to somehow escalate this confrontation in the way my extremist training had prepared me to do. But every time I tried to speak, every time I attempted to form words of hatred or condemnation, the burning in my throat intensified to the point where I could barely breathe, let alone speak. It was as if an invisible hand was preventing me from continuing my assault on this faithful servant of God. My attempts to curse at her, to call her names, to continue the verbal abuse that should have followed my physical attack were all stopped by the supernatural fire that was now consuming my entire respiratory system. The words would form in my mind, but when I tried to speak them, only gasping and coughing came out of my mouth. I had been rendered speechless by a force far greater than my hatred. Instead of walking away from me or calling for security, which would have been completely justified given what I had just done to her, the sister began praying aloud for me right there on the busy sidewalk. Her voice was gentle but strong, filled with genuine concern for my spiritual and physical condition. She wasn't praying for protection from me or asking God to punish me for my attack. She was praying for my healing and salvation. Dear Jesus, I heard her say as I struggled with the burning sensation, please heal this young man who is clearly in pain. Open his heart to your love and show him the truth about who you are. Remove the hatred from his heart and replace it with your peace. Her words were spoken with such sincerity, such genuine love for someone who had just attacked her, that they cut through my confusion and rage like a sword. I grabbed my throat with both hands, gasping and coughing, but nothing would relieve the supernatural burning sensation that was now spreading into my chest. People walking by were starting to stare, some stopping to ask if I was choking or needed medical attention. But I knew this wasn't a medical emergency in the conventional sense. This was something far more serious. something that required divine intervention rather than human aid. The physical distress was unlike anything I had ever experienced, but even more disturbing was the growing realization that this was connected to my attack on the sister. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental. The moment I had spat on her, this burning had begun. The moment she had responded with blessing instead of cursing, the burning had intensified. There was a clear cause and effect relationship that my rational mind couldn't deny. As she continued to pray for me, I began to understand that I wasn't just experiencing a random medical event or psychosomatic response to guilt. This was divine judgment, supernatural intervention, the hand of God Himself reaching down to stop my attack on His faithful servant. The God I had been taught to worship as Allah was revealing Himself as the same God this Christian nun served, and He was not pleased with my hatred and violence. The burning became so intense that I could taste something metallic in my mouth, could feel my tongue swelling slightly, could sense that my entire respiratory system was being affected by whatever supernatural force had been unleashed the moment my spit hit her face. I tried to speak again, tried to ask her what was happening to me, but only strangled gasps came out. Think about a time when you knew beyond any doubt that you were experiencing something supernatural, something that couldn't be explained by natural causes or coincidence. That's exactly what was happening to me as I stood there on that sidewalk, unable to speak, unable to continue my attack, unable to do anything but experience the reality of divine intervention in response to my hatred. The sister continued her prayer, and I could hear her asking Jesus to heal me, to open my eyes to His truth, to transform my heart from hatred to love. The irony wasn't lost on me even in my distress. I had attacked her with the worst kind of disrespect and humiliation, and she was responding by interceding with her God on my behalf. Everything I had been taught about Christians being hateful and vindictive was being disproven by her actions in real time. Recognition began dawning through the physical pain and panic. This wasn't just a medical emergency or a psychosomatic response to guilt. This was something far more serious, far more significant. This was a divine encounter, a supernatural intervention, the living God making Himself known to a young man whose heart had been poisoned by hatred and extremism. Suddenly, as the burning in my throat reached its peak intensity, I knew with absolute certainty that I was experiencing divine judgment for my hatred and attack on God's servant. This wasn't a medical condition, wasn't a psychosomatic response to guilt, wasn't some bizarre coincidence. This was the hand of Almighty God reaching down from heaven to personally intervene in my life at the exact moment when I had crossed a line that should never be crossed. The revelation hit me like a lightning bolt of truth that illuminated every corner of my darkened understanding, all my radical beliefs, all my carefully constructed justifications for hating Christians, all the extremist propaganda I had consumed for years crumbled in an instant when faced with this supernatural intervention. I had been living in a house of lies, and God Himself had just torn the roof off to let His light shine into the darkness of my deluded heart. I realized in that moment that the God of this nun was not some false deity as I had been taught, but the same God I had been trying to worship my entire life. The Allah I claimed to serve and the Jesus this sister followed were one and the same divine being. and he was making it clear that my hatred was an abomination to him. My years of extremist indoctrination had blinded me to the truth that there is only one God, and he loves all his children, regardless of how they choose to worship him. Understanding flooded through me with the force of a tsunami, washing away years of carefully constructed prejudice and hatred. I saw clearly for the first time that my attack on this innocent woman wasn't an act of religious devotion, as I had convinced myself, but a sin against the very God I claimed to serve. I had become exactly what I despised in others, someone who used religion as an excuse for hatred rather than love. The burning in my throat became so intense that my legs gave out beneath me, and I collapsed to my knees right there on the busy downtown sidewalk. Passers-by stopped to stare at this strange scene. A young Middle Eastern man on his knees, in apparent agony, while an elderly nun knelt beside him in prayer. To them, it probably looked like I was having some kind of medical emergency. They had no way of knowing they were witnessing divine intervention in real time. The sister immediately knelt beside me without any concern for her own dignity or safety, placing her withered hand gently on my shoulder as I gasped and clutched at my throat. She could have walked away, could have called security, could have left me to suffer the consequences of my actions alone. Instead, she chose to stay with me in my moment of divine discipline, continuing to pray for the very person who had just assaulted her in the most degrading way possible. Her response to my distress was immediate and compassionate. Instead of viewing my supernatural suffering as justice deserved, she saw it as an opportunity for God to work in my life. She continued praying aloud, asking Jesus to heal me physically and spiritually, to open my heart to his love, to transform my hatred into understanding. Her prayers weren't just words, they were filled with genuine concern for my eternal soul. Part of me wanted to resist what was happening, to maintain my hatred and extremist beliefs, despite the overwhelming evidence that they were wrong. The years of indoctrination didn't disappear immediately. They fought against this new understanding like antibodies fighting an infection. But the physical reality of God's discipline, combined with the sister's incredible display of love and forgiveness, was breaking down every wall I had built around my heart. Ask yourself this question honestly. When was the last time someone responded to your attack with prayer instead of revenge? When did you last witness love triumphing over hatred in such a dramatic and undeniable way? Most of us go through life without ever seeing such a clear demonstration of divine grace. But I was experiencing it firsthand in the most humbling way possible. The burning in my throat was unlike any physical pain I had ever experienced, but it was also unlike any spiritual awakening I could have imagined. Every wave of supernatural fire that coursed through my respiratory system carried with it a message from God. Your hatred stops here. Your attacks on my servants end now. Your heart will be transformed, whether you want it to be or not. This was divine love expressed through divine discipline. As the sister prayed over me, I began to understand that this supernatural intervention wasn't just about punishing me for my attack. It was about saving me from a past that would have led to even worse actions, even greater sins, even deeper spiritual darkness. God was stopping me in my tracks before I could do something that would destroy not just others, but my own soul completely. The conviction that flooded my heart was overwhelming in its completeness. Every hateful thought I had entertained, every moment I had celebrated violence against Christians, every time I had consumed extremist propaganda and felt justified in my anger, all of it was revealed to be not just wrong, but absolutely abhorrent to the God I claimed to serve. I saw myself as he saw me, a young man whose heart had been poisoned by lies. Fighting against this conviction was like trying to hold back the ocean with my bare hands. The truth was too powerful, too complete, too undeniable to resist any longer. I had been living in darkness and calling it light, following hatred and calling it righteousness, serving Satan while claiming to serve God. The supernatural fire in my throat was burning away every lie I had believed about myself and my faith. I wanted to speak, to confess what I was understanding, to ask forgiveness for years of misguided hatred, but my throat remained paralyzed by the divine fire. It was as if God was requiring me to experience complete helplessness, complete dependence on His mercy before He would allow me to speak again. I had to learn what it meant to be powerless before I could understand what it meant to be forgiven. The moment of surrender came when I stopped fighting the conviction and simply accepted the truth that was being revealed to my heart. I had been wrong about everything. My hatred had been sin. My attacks had been evil. My extremist beliefs had been lies from the pit of hell. The nun I had attacked was a better Muslim than I had ever been, because she was actually living out the love and compassion that true faith requires. As I knelt there on the sidewalk, unable to speak, but finally able to see clearly, I knew that my life was about to change forever. The God who had disciplined me with supernatural fire was the same God who had sent his faithful servant to show me what real love looked like. This wasn't the end of my story, it was the beginning of my salvation. As the sister continued praying over me, something miraculous began to happen. The supernatural burning in my mouth and throat that had been so intense I could barely breathe started to gradually subside. It wasn't an immediate relief, but rather a slow, gentle cooling that began at the edges of the fire and worked its way inward. With each word of her prayer, with each plea she made to Jesus on my behalf, the divine flames that had been consuming my respiratory system began to retreat. The release came in waves, like cool water being poured over a raging fire. First, I could swallow without excruciating pain. Then, the metallic taste in my mouth began to fade. Slowly, carefully, I attempted to take deeper breaths and found that the crushing sensation in my chest was lifting. It was as if an invisible hand was gradually removing the supernatural judgment that had been placed upon me, responding to the intercession of this faithful woman who had every right to leave me suffering but chose instead to pray for my healing. When I could finally speak again, when the last of the supernatural fire had retreated enough to allow words to form, the first sounds that came out of my mouth surprised even me. Instead of the hateful curses I had been trying to speak earlier, instead of the extremist rhetoric that had filled my vocabulary for years, I heard myself saying in a voice barely above a whisper, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for what I did to you." The words came from a place deeper than my conscious mind, from a part of my soul that the supernatural encounter had awakened. These weren't calculated words designed to get me out of trouble or manipulate her sympathy. They were the genuine cry of a heart that was finally seeing clearly, finally understanding the magnitude of what I had done, not just to her personally, but to the God we both served. Tears began streaming down my face as the full weight of my actions hit me. I had attacked an elderly woman who had devoted her entire life to serving others. I had humiliated someone whose only crime was choosing to follow Jesus instead of Muhammad. I had committed an act of such cruelty and disrespect that it shamed not just me, but every Muslim who truly understood what Islam teaches about treating others with dignity and honor. The sister helped me to my feet with gentle hands, showing no fear despite what I had just done to her, displaying no anger despite having every right to be furious with me. As I stood on shaken legs, she looked directly into my eyes and spoke words that would change my life forever. Jesus forgives you, and so do I. He has plans for your life that are greater than your hatred, plans that you cannot imagine from where you stand right now. Her forgiveness hit me harder than any punishment could have. I had been prepared for anger, for retaliation, for her to call security and have me arrested for assault. What I wasn't prepared for was grace, unmerited favor from someone I had wronged in the most degrading way possible. Her words about Jesus forgiving me penetrated straight to my heart because I knew that what had just happened to me supernaturally was proof that Jesus was real and powerful. For the first time in my life, I experienced what true forgiveness felt like, and it was nothing like what my extremist teachers had told me. They had taught me that Allah was primarily a God of judgment and wrath, that His love had to be earned through perfect religious observance. But this sister was showing me a God whose love was freely given even to those who attacked His servants, a God whose mercy was greater than human hatred. Understanding flooded through me as I realized that grace isn't just a theological concept, but a living reality that transforms hearts and lives. Standing there on that sidewalk, still trembling from my supernatural encounter, I understood that the Jesus this nun served wasn't the false God I had been taught he was, but the same divine being I had been trying to reach through my Islamic prayers. He was real, he was powerful, and he had just personally intervened in my life to save me from my own hatred. The sister then did something that demonstrated the incredible love of Christ in action. Instead of walking away from me or ending our encounter, she invited me inside the cathedral to meet with the priest, to learn about the Jesus who had just disciplined and healed me. She was offering me the opportunity to understand what had just happened, to learn about the God who could stop hatred with supernatural power, yet offer forgiveness in the same breath. Fear and hope battled in my heart as I considered her invitation. Part of me was terrified to enter a Christian church, still influenced by years of extremist teaching that portrayed such buildings as enemy territory. But a larger part of me was desperately curious about this God who could work such miracles, who could transform hatred into love through divine intervention. I needed to understand what had happened to me, needed to know more about this Jesus who was nothing like what I had been taught. I don't know if I should, I said honestly, looking up at the cathedral that towered above us. I've spent years believing that people like you were my enemies. I don't know how to process what just happened to me. Don't know what it means for everything I've believed about God and faith and truth. The sister smiled with the patience of someone who had spent decades helping lost souls find their way home. Jesus specializes in working with people who don't have everything figured out, she said gently. He's not looking for perfection. He's looking for hearts that are open to receiving his love. And from what I just witnessed, your heart has been opened in a very dramatic way. Walking into that cathedral felt like crossing a bridge from one world to another. The same building that had filled me with rage just an hour earlier now seemed to radiate peace and welcome. The cross that had once represented everything I hated about Christianity now appeared to be pointing toward truths I had been searching for my entire life without knowing it. Father Michael, the priest, greeted me with the same grace the sister had shown, welcoming me without condemnation, despite the obvious signs of my recent distress. When I told him what had happened outside, instead of expressing shock or disbelief, he simply nodded, as if supernatural encounters were not entirely uncommon in his experience of ministry. His response told me that the God I was encountering wasn't distant or abstract, but actively involved in the lives of those who sought him. That afternoon, as Father Michael explained the gospel message to me, I began to understand that Jesus hadn't just disciplined me for my attack on his servant. He had revealed himself to me in the most dramatic way possible because he loved me too much to let me continue on a path that would destroy my soul. The same hands that had sent supernatural fire to stop my hatred were the same hands that had been wounded on the cross to pay for my sins. When Father Michael asked if I wanted to accept Christ as my Savior, I knew that this wasn't just a religious decision, but a response to a divine encounter that had already transformed my heart. I accepted Jesus that afternoon not because someone convinced me intellectually, but because I had experienced his power and love in ways that left no room for doubt. 6 years have passed since that life changing afternoon outside the cathedral, and today I serve as an outreach coordinator at that same church where I first encountered the transforming power of Jesus Christ. Every morning when I walk through those doors that once filled me with hatred, I'm reminded of the miracle of God's grace that can take someone consumed by religious extremism and turn them into a servant of his love. The building that represented everything I despised has become my spiritual home, the place where I've learned what it truly means to worship God in spirit and in truth. The transformation in my life has been so complete and radical that sometimes I struggle to believe it myself. The hatred that once consumed my heart, that drove me to commit such a shameful act against an innocent servant of God, has been completely replaced with love for the very people I used to despise. Where I once saw enemies, I now see brothers and sisters in Christ. Where I once felt anger and resentment, I now experience peace and joy that surpasses all understanding. My daily work involves reaching out to Muslim immigrants who are struggling with the same issues I faced when I first arrived in America. I spend my time building relationships with young men who carry the same anger I once carried, who have been influenced by the same extremist propaganda that poisoned my own heart for so many years. When I share my story with them, when I tell them about the supernatural encounter that changed everything for me, I can see in their eyes the same confusion and curiosity I felt when Sister Margaret first showed me grace instead of condemnation. Sister Margaret became like a mother to me from That very first day until her death 2 years ago, constantly showing me what Christian love looks like in action through her daily example of grace and compassion. She never once reminded me of what I had done to her, never made me feel ashamed or guilty about the way our relationship began. Instead, she poured into my life with the same love she would have shown her own son, teaching me through her actions what it means to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. The lesson she taught me went far beyond theology or church doctrine. Through her daily example, I learned that authentic faith isn't about perfect religious performance, but about allowing God's love to flow through you to others, especially to those who don't deserve it. She showed me that Christianity isn't a religion of rules and regulations, but a relationship with the living God who transforms hearts and lives from the inside out. When Sister Margaret passed away, I was one of the speakers at her funeral, sharing with a packed cathedral how this remarkable woman had responded to hatred with love, to attack with blessing, to persecution with prayer. I told the congregation how her Christ like response to my shameful behavior had been the catalyst for my transformation, how her willingness to see past my actions to the broken heart beneath had literally saved my soul from destruction. The personal cost of my conversion has been significant and ongoing. My biological family disowned me completely when I made my decision to follow Christ public. My father, who had been my hero growing up, hasn't spoken a word to me since the day I told him about my conversion. My mother calls occasionally, but every conversation ends with her in tears, convinced that I've thrown away my eternal soul for a false religion and that she'll never see me in paradise. My brothers and sisters treat me as if I'm dead, as if the son and brother they once knew ceased to exist the moment I accepted Jesus as my Savior. Family gatherings that I once looked forward to are now painful reminders of the relationships I've lost in exchange for the relationship with Christ I've gained. The rejection from my blood relatives cuts deeper than I can adequately express, especially during holidays and special occasions when the absence in my life feels most acute. But while I lost my earthly family, I gained something far more valuable, a spiritual family in Christ that has loved me unconditionally from the moment I walked through the doors of this cathedral 6 years ago. The congregation didn't see my past when they welcomed me. They saw my potential. They didn't focus on where I had come from. They celebrated where God was taking me. They embraced me as a brother, even when my own brothers rejected me as a traitor. The daily miracle of my transformed life never stops amazing me. Every morning when I wake up, I'm struck by the peace that fills my heart where hatred used to reside. When I encounter other Muslims in my outreach work, instead of feeling the familiar anger and resentment that once consumed me, I feel compassion and love for their spiritual condition. I see them not as enemies of Christianity, but as fellow seekers who haven't yet discovered the truth about Jesus Christ. Through my ministry, I've had the incredible privilege of leading 12 other Muslim immigrants to Christ, using my own story of transformation as a bridge to help them understand that Jesus isn't the enemy of Islam, but the fulfillment of everything Islam points toward. Each conversion is a reminder of God's grace. Each transformed life is a proof that no heart is too hardened for the love of Christ to penetrate and change. Look inside your own heart right now and ask yourself honestly, Is there hatred there that's poisoning your relationship with God and others? Are there people you've written off as enemies when God sees them as potential children? Are you harboring resentment and anger that's eating away at your own soul while accomplishing nothing positive in the world? The power of how we respond to attacks and persecution cannot be overstated. Sister Margaret's decision to respond to my hatred with love, to my attack with blessing, to my persecution with prayer, literally saved my soul from destruction. She could have reacted with anger, could have demanded justice, could have treated me as the enemy I believed myself to be. Instead, she chose to see past my actions to the broken heart beneath, and that choice changed the trajectory of my eternal destiny. I learned through her example that love truly does conquer hate, that grace is more powerful than judgment, that the gospel of Jesus Christ has the power to transform even the most hardened heart. When we respond to evil with good, to hatred with love, to persecution with prayer, we're not just being nice or politically correct. We're participating in the very nature of God Himself, who loved us while we were still His enemies. So I'm asking you, just as Sister Margaret's life asked me, is there someone you need to forgive instead of attack? Is there a person who has wronged you that you need to respond to with grace instead of revenge? Are you willing to let God use your response to hatred as a catalyst for transformation in someone else's life? The universal truth that my story illustrates is this: if God can change a heart as hardened and hateful as mine was, filled with religious extremism and violence, He can change absolutely any heart that's willing to receive His love. No one is too far gone for God's grace. No sin is too great for His forgiveness. No hatred is too deep for His love to overcome and transform. My name is Owais, and I am living proof that no one is beyond the reach of God's transforming grace, that no heart is too hard for His love to penetrate and change completely.